Hello everybody, this is a video presentation for my Year 12 Mathematics students. This is focusing on linear graphs and I guess a number of concepts related to linear graphs, and it's mainly from exercise 2C. Now we're going to focus on these particular points and I'll ask a number of questions related to these. So for the points 3, 2 and -5, -2, find the distance between them. So if you would imagine where they were, let's draw a graph. So 3, 2, somewhere here, and -5, -2, there. So that means we want to find the distance from there to there. Alright, now let's see, from -5 across to 3, that's 8 across, and from -2 up to 2, that is 4 up. So we could use Pythagoras' theorem and say x would be equal to the square root of 8 squared plus 4 squared. Now 8 squared is 64 and 4 squared is 16, and 64 plus 16 is the square root of 80. And we can simplify down that third into 4 root 5. Now there is a formula that you could use, and the formula says the distance is equal to the square root of x1 minus x2 squared plus y1 minus y2 squared. And all you'd have to do is just assign a point, say this is 1 and that'd be x1 and that'd be y1, and this is point number 2 and that'd be x2 and that'd be y2. You could substitute that points into this formula here and you could work it out in exactly the same way. Alright, let's move on to another aspect of the problem. Alright, so what we're doing now is we're using the same points as we used previously, here and here, same points as before, and we want to find the midpoint between these two. So if again we draw up a graph here, and 3, 2 is up about here, and -5, -2 is somewhere down around there. Halfway between these two has got to be some point around here. Alrighty. Now what we can do is say, well, what's halfway between -5 and 3? So if we said -5 plus 3 all divided by 2, well, -5 plus 3 is -2. -2 over 2 is -1. So our midpoint here would be at -1. And this is the x-coordinate. Now the y-coordinate, well, what's halfway between -2 and 2? Well, 2 plus -2 divided by 2, well, 2 plus -2 is 0. Okay, so it'd have to be about there. Alright. Oops, sorry, I think I plotted that wrong. It's about here on the x-axis. So the midpoint is -1, 0. Now there is a formula as well, and I use the midpoint is xm, ym, so that's the midpoint. M for midpoint is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2 divided by 2 over y1 plus y2 divided by 2, which is kind of the same idea that I used up here. Alrighty, so there's the midpoint. It is at -1, 0, so right there. Okay, here's the third and I guess fourth part of the questions. Find the gradient. Now that's the third part. Find the gradient between the points, the 3, 2 and -5, 2, and the equation of a linear graph. So we want the equation of a linear graph. Well, let's find the gradient first of all. So most of you will probably be aware of y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we can say, well, here's point number 1, and here's the x-coordinate of point number 1, and here's the y-coordinate of point number 1. Here's number 2, here's the x-coordinate of point number 2, and the y-coordinate of point number 2. And you put all that into this equation, so -2 minus another 2, so that's y2 minus y1, and x2 minus x1, so -5 minus 3. So that is -4 over -8 and the negatives cancel out, and the 4 and the 8 cancel out to be a gradient of 1/2. Now I suppose the other thing you could do if you wanted to is you could just draw a graph and say, well, -5, -2 is down there, and 3, 2 is up there. How far across do I go? Well, it's 8 across, and how far up do I go? It's 4 up. What's the gradient? Rise over run, 4 over 8. Same thing as we got over here, 1/2. Now for the equation, if we have y equals mx plus c, if the gradient is 1/2, now let's see, we could substitute in either one of these 2 points and it really doesn't matter. I might choose 3, 2, and in place of y I'll put in 2, because from there's 2, and in place of x is 3. So 1/2 times 3 is 3 over 2, and let's see, if we took this across to the other side, we'd end up with 2, take away 3 over 2, so c would be equal to 1/2. Therefore my graph would be 1/2 x, which we got from there, and the c is 1/2. So the equation for the straight line going through this point and this point is y equals 1/2 x plus 1/2. Okay, so here's the next part of the problem. Find the equation of a line, so the equation of a straight line that goes through 7, 3 and is parallel to the 2 points that we've been using all along. So the gradient between these two is 1/2. We worked that out a number of times before. But we now want it to go through this point 7, 3. So if we said y is equal to mx plus c, which is just the kind of general rule for a straight line, and we put in 1/2. And then we said, alright, well we've got to use this other point here, 7, 3, so in place of y is 3, in place of x is 7. So, let's see, 1/2 times 7 is 7 over 2. Now if we minus 7 over 2 from both sides, it'll cancel down on the right hand side and just leave c, and that'll leave minus 1/2. So, therefore the graph would be y equals 1/2 x minus 1/2. Alrighty, one more part to this question. Okay, so here's probably the most difficult part of the question, and it says find the perpendicular bisector between the points that we've been using all along, 3, 2 and -5, -2. So if we draw it up, what is the perpendicular bisector? Well, if -5, -2 is down there, and 3, 2 is up there, well, if there's a midpoint between these two graphs, and it's right there. So there's the midpoint, -1, 0. We worked that out before. And we want a line that is perpendicular to this line here, this blue line. So if we said, alright, well, here's a line that is perpendicular to that. It goes through the midpoint there, and is perpendicular to the line we had before. So the equation for this line, what is it? Alrighty, so we know that our perpendicular bisector, so I'll go bisector, now let's see, it goes through the point -1, 0, and we worked that out before, but you could easily work it out again if you wanted to figure out the midpoint between -5, 2 and 3, 2. Now the other thing we need to know is the gradient. Now we figured out before that the gradient of this is 1/2. Now I think you all know that when you multiply two gradients together that are perpendicular, the product is -1. So if we said, okay, well the product that we want to figure out will be -1 over our gradient. Okay, so that would be -1 over 1/2, which would mean the gradient for our perpendicular bisector would be -2. Now, I think Mr. Ward uses a slightly different one. He says the gradient is equal to negative 1 over. So all you really need to do is just plug the gradient into there. And negative 1 over 1/2, well, how many 1/2s in 1? That's 2. So our gradient will be negative 2. And if you look at this line here, it seems to have quite a steep negative gradient. So this kind of makes sense. So all we need to do now is say y is equal to mx plus c. We know that the gradient is negative 2x, so in place of m goes negative 2, and in place of y and x can go, in place of x is negative 1, in place of y is 0. Negative 2 times negative 1, so that would be 0 is equal to negative 2 times negative 1 is 2, so c would be equal to negative 2. Therefore, the graph would be negative 2x minus 2. And that seems to make sense based on this graph here. This is the last part of the question. Look, if you have any more questions about 2C, please ask me in class and I'll help you out then. See you then.